19th and 20th century. At the moment she holds a research fellowship at the International Research Centre for Cultural Studies in Vienna, and her current research interests are focusing on material cultures of psychiatry.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Yes, I'm a historian. I'm working on material cultures of psychiatry, or that is my focus, or the focus of my interest at the moment. And today I will talk about the sickbed in psychiatry, so we will dip into the history of psychiatry from the beginning of the 20th century. So, my talk today will focus on the sickbed in asylums at the beginning of the 20th century, more precisely on its scenography and performativity. My starting point will be the introduction of the so-called bed rest, in German it's Bettbehandlung, as a new method of treatment at the end of the 19th century that was widely applied in German-speaking asylums since that time. It led in many ways to a fundamental modification of psychiatric facilities and left significant architectural marks until the 1980s, when a report claimed that most of the facilities, psychiatric facilities, were very, very old, and that goes back to the introduction of bed rest. In short, bed rest meant that patients, regardless of whether they were noisy or calm, depressive or manic, newly admitted or not, had to stay in bed for weeks and even months. With the implementation of bed rest, the sickbed shifted from a mostly quotidian and ordinary object to an important agent on which a new scenography of the psychiatric space was based. Wards were now rearranged around the bed. The bed became an agent onto which actions were transferred and where psychiatric discourses and concepts were put into practice. As an interface between attendants, physicians, and patients, the bed framed the encounter and assigned each of them to a specific place. That means that new performances, as well as relationships between attendants, physicians, and patients, were acted out by staging the bed at the center of the ward. Due to the long time that patients had to rest in bed, the bed was no longer just a place where to sleep or repose. Spending weeks or months, day and night in bed, the bed necessarily became a place of being, an active and physical material, an object of personal appropriation, and a space in itself, as I will explain. It generated manifold meanings that could not be determined in advance by doctors or attendants. So speaking of the performativity of the sickbed means to draw one's attention to its network of contexts, so to say, not to ask what the bed is, but what the bed does and how it performs under certain conditions, and how others interact with the bed and use its material and spatial qualities. So I will start my talk by focusing on this new scenography of the asylums as a result of the implementation of bed rest, and then I will explain how the bed was appropriated in a variety of ways by patients. So, staging the bed. This picture from 1910 shows the ground plot of the main building for the accommodation of male patients in German asylum Emmendingen. As I hope you can see, there were predominantly isolation cells. It's in this row. There is one cell next to the other. As one report from Emmendingen stated, there was usually not even a bed in these cells. Just straw or horsehair was given to patients to sleep on the floor. And patients spent months and even years isolated in those cells. This spatial configuration had been utilized in nearly all asylums before the implementation of bed rest. Isolation was perceived as a method of treatment, but came already under criticism at the end of the 19th century and should be replaced by bed rest. But bed rest as a new method of treatment was based on the institutionalization of patients in large wards. So bed rest required an architectural modification and a restructuring of space. Isolation cells, like for example those in Emmendingen, were closed down and its walls were demolished. Large wards, according to those in general hospitals, were then established and arranged with beds that were lined in rows. These new wards were established for 10 or even more patients and were class divided in wards for agitated and for calm patients. The new title of these wards was surveillance wards, because methods of restraint should now be replaced by constant and severe surveillance. So these new wards were organized around beds, as this schematic drawing of a female patient from a Swiss mental hospital illustrates. Due to the abstract nature of this drawing, it highlights the significance of the bedsteads for this new scenography. The neatly arranged bedsteads on the left and on the right are the central elements of this in that drawing. In the middle of it, you can see a room. A large table, 2 chairs, as well as a third chair on a little more down below. To sit on the table was often reserved only for those patients who were on their way to recovery, because only those were allowed to leave the bed. The illustration points out that the bedstead was more than an object of therapy. It had specific spatial qualities and was therefore introduced as a necessary element to structure and order the ward, so that the ward in itself evolved its therapeutic effects that were equally bound to the object and to the space. So here are some historical photos from different German asylums that were taken of these new wards. Here from the Landeshospital Heine, published in a book from Johannes Pressler. Here another ward in the Philips Hospital. Here also from the Philips Hospital. Here from the 1920s, I think, it seems to be. And here in the 1950s, so there are more and more beds in the room. The reordering of the wards through the implementation of the bed had remarkable effects on the social life within the wards, more precisely on power relations and the hierarchies between attendants, physicians, and patients. The bed as an object that related to horizontal position played an important part to stabilize asymmetrical power relations between these actors. The bedstead not only ordered the ward, but it also ordered the different groups of people in that ward by assigning each of them to a specific place that coincided with a specific way of doing things or appropriating things, or more generally, with a specific way of being. While patients were instructed to be calm, to stay in bed and to recline, attendants were instructed to be attentive, to walk around and monitor. Each assigned position, the horizontal and the vertical, framed one's possibility to move, perceive, and act. It made a meaningful difference to be vertical or horizontal. As this picture, for example, points out. We see the attendants standing upright next to the patients that were lying in bed. So the overview of the ward belonged to the attendants. To put patients in a horizontal position ordered by the arrangement of the bedsteads in the ward facilitated the attendants' duty to monitor. This new scenography of the ward followed the paradigm of visibility and order. In terms of clinical observation, the bed became a stage where everything that the patient did was noted and reported and related to. While the attendants on this picture were standing upright, the patients were lying in bed, and their perception of the ward, of other patients as well as of themselves, was framed by the horizontal position. They were lying close to each other, but yet separated and isolated. Being institutionalized together with other patients in a ward should make the mentally ill realize that they were sick, like the other ones that were lying in bed around them. Being put to bed reinforced patients' feeling of submission and subjected the newly admitted patients to the will of the physician. This interpersonal dynamic between doctor and patient was seen as a precondition for fitting the sick person into the medical regime through the strict following through of the physician's instructions and commands. One female patient of the Psychiatric University Clinic in Heidelberg, who was treated with bed rest, stated in September 1895 that she felt disabled and become discouraged and weak-willed like a child. So as a historian, I read a lot of patient records, and the bed is really a very important point there. What this patient described as irritating was seen as an important step on the way to convince her that she was sick and to confirm her to the doctor's will. As long as the patient showed no self-awareness of his or her disorder, he or she had to stay in bed. This was part of the discursive space of the institute. This was the agency that the doctors assigned to the bed. Referring to the sociologist Bruno Latour, the bed can be described as a non-human actor. But sometimes patients rejected this kind of agency that doctors delegated to the bed. So the patient Siegfried L., who was also institutionalized in Heidelberg, doubted that he could recover by staying in bed because, as he told the doctor, he became insane there. For him, the bed was anything else than a good place for recover. On the contrary, he felt like he was losing his mind. So Siegfried L. rejected the medical meaning that was assigned to the bed. But speaking from a horizontal position that framed his actions and determined the meaning of his statements, Siegfried L. could not convince the doctors to cease the treatment. For those patients who were treated with bed rest and who spent weeks or months isolated within the space that the bed demarcated, the bed became a place of being. So, for example, patients were writing letters or reports in bed. They were reading, stitching, or sewing. They were eating and drinking, observing and communicating. They were singing, mumbling, talking, narrating, shouting, crying. They were crawling under the blanket or turning their face on the wall. They were protesting. They were remembering and daydreaming and hallucinating. In the words of French structuralist Roland Barthes, the sickbed can be described as a proxemic space. The word proxemic is derived from the Latin word proximus, which means next or neighbor. It referred to the human use and arrangement of space, as well as the relationship between a being and its immediate environment. So for Roland Barthes, the proxemic space is the very limited, though familiar space that environs the subject. It can be described as a place of self-identification or a territory of self. In the words of Barthes, it is the intimate arrangement of objects that someone can reach with his or her arm, without moving the body or leaving that space. It is the cubic meter of space that is close to the body, a place for hiding and hoarding things, as well as a stage upon which one can display the most emblematic gestures. In his writings, Roland Barthes compares the bed with an organ or limb. So it fits to the biological architecture. To him, the sickbed is the most intensively experienced proxemic space due to the long time that people who are ill have to stay there. As a space in itself, the sickbed is not, as one may presume, limited to the range of one's arm. Ears and eyes extend that space. So the patient's gaze may be limited to the walls of the ward. However, it can go beyond if there's an open door or a window. So the windows of a ward, and particularly the view out of the window, were highly relevant in mental hospitals, as exhibited by many patients' drawings. For example, this drawing from a male patient from a Swiss mental hospital. His drawing of the sick ward with the large windows in the back and the open door on the left contrasted the world inside with the world outside, the languishing and decay of the sick with the flourishing of nature. Another example. Wilhelm Müller, who was institutionalized in the Asylum Domjüch and whose works are part of the famous Prinzhorn collection in Heidelberg, sketched a view out of his window 48 times within 2 years and made notes about the weather, season, time of the day, climate and colors. This is one of these pictures. So it's the view onto the lake that was in front of his room. When the body was not allowed to move, the movements of the eyes had greater significance, as another drawing from a patient who was institutionalized in a Swiss mental hospital and treated by the famous psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach, illustrates. The drawing shows a cell or a single room that is equipped with a bed. A figure is standing bedside and looking through the bed window. Due to the two lines the patient drew, coming out from his eyes, these two lines, we can follow his gaze that is crossing the street and leading to the building on the opposite side. While the patient was most probably not allowed to leave the room, his eyes found a way out. The picture highlights the significance of seeing, especially for patients who were confined to the bed or whose movements were restricted to a room. The patient noted the words bed, there, and street on his drawing and explained, here on the right, that the picture illustrates the laugh of Mr. Fritschi. Another drawing from a male patient who was also in a Swiss mental hospital deals with a similar subject. The drawing shows once again a small room, as the outlines of the wall suggest, equipped with a bed. It could be the self-portrait of someone who's lying in bed because we don't see the head or the trunk, but two naked legs stretched out of the bed. The center and vanishing point of the picture is a massive door that stands wide open and that may be perceived as a promise of walking, of going around, of leaving, especially to someone who was restricted to bed and had to hold his legs literally off the ground. The same patient drew another very similar picture, but this time from another perspective. So this time we see the look out of the window into the nature. So for those patients who were forcibly prescribed bed rest and who spent weeks or months isolated in the space that the bed delineated, the bed became a place of being. In the patient record of Helen Prager, who was institutionalized for more than 20 years in a mental hospital near Dresden, doctors noted that she was literally living in bed. All her activities referred to the bed, which she appropriated as a territory of self, and that she didn't want to leave anymore. While she was lying in bed, she wrote letters to her family and reports to the doctors. She did handwork, read books, and drew pictures. All the things that she collected and hoarded in her bed marked this space as a place that belonged to her. She placed staples of paper, clothes, sewing materials around her bed, so that it was difficult for the doctors and attendants to approach her. She also hoarded all these things in her bed, slept on her files, and didn't allow to make her bed or to take anything away. Otherwise, she became violent and difficult to restrain. The bed was a territory of self to her that she expanded step by step with all the materials that she was hoarding and stapling in and around the bed. She even expanded her territory with a stick that helped her to close the window without leaving the bed when attendants had opened it for airing. So she just was lying in bed, and with the stick she could close the window. So she successfully defended her territory against the interventions from doctors and attendants. Also, patients rest in bed to recover. They were not just lying there. They appropriated the bed in very different ways. The bed and all the things that belonged to it, the pillow, the blanket, the linen, the fabric, the mattress, even its horsehair stuffing, as well as the bedstead itself, could be of use for the purpose and intentions of a patient, like these following pictures illustrate. This should be the first. The first picture shows a man who holds a puppet-like object in his hand that he made out of his linen. This picture was published in the textbook of German psychiatrist Wilhelm Weigand. Other picture shows a woman on a floor bed with a range of handcrafted objects that she made out of different textiles. She presented the objects on a quilted blanket that was given especially to those patients who were constantly tearing the linen. Due to the scope of action that was determined by the bed and to the lack of other means of expression, these materials gained high importance for the patients. So also for Marie Lieb, who was also a patient in Heidelberg at the end of the 19th century. She also tore constantly the linen that attendants gave her to cover herself when she was isolated in a cell. With the strips that she had torn, she laid patterns and symbols on the floor that caught the attention of the doctor, who photographed 2 of her very own scenographies. The doctor noted that Marie-Liebe cherished her work, which she destroyed only after a few days. One of these pictures, there are 2 pictures, this is the first, and this is the second. And here it was published in, once again, a textbook from Wilhelm Weigand, who judged these acts as merely expression of her disease. So those patients who were treated with bed rest were not allowed to leave the bed. In a collection of photographs that were taken in a mental asylum from southern Germany in the years between 1909 and 1912, there are 2 pictures that attracted my attention. The first one shows a bed with a white blanket, a pillow, and a tuft of hair looking out from the blanket. It seems as if someone is lying in bed, hiding under the blanket, as it was often reported in patient records, when patients were treated with bed rest and wanted to be insulated from the outside world. They crawled under their blankets and stayed there for a certain time. By doing that, patients became nearly invisible without breaking the medical chain of command to stay in bed. So this is the first picture. The second picture shows again a bed where the blanket is put aside so that we can see that it's not a real body that is lying in bed, but the montage of a body that is made out of clothes and scarves. It seems as if someone created a decoy to give the illusion that he or she was lying in bed and following the medical regime, while the real self had already left the place to which he or she had been assigned. I come to an end now, and I make it short due to the advanced time. I just wanted to show you that the implementation of bed rest changed tremendously the scenography of psychiatry at the beginning of the 20th century, and that this new scenography led to manifold ways to appropriate the bed, that for patients was more than an object of therapy. It was a place of being, and therefore a place of actions. Thank you.